Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to welcome you to the wonderful endocrine system. Yeah, the endocrine system is one of our most important systems of the body because endocrine is a system that is releasing hormones. So these are cells, of course, that are clustered in groups which we call glands, and glands are specialized groups of cells that are secreting. And so these particular glands are secreting into the bloodstream, and so they're referred to as endocrine. And what is it they're secreting? Let's get right into that conversation. What they're secreting are hormones, and hormones are chemicals. They can be rather large and they can be rather small, and they can be classified either as being a steroid, which is a type of lipid, or a non-steroid, anything that is not a steroid, which are usually small peptides and proteins. So hormones, the word hormone itself is kind of interesting. It comes from a word meaning to excite or to set into motion. And so that kind of tells you a lot about what the hormone's all about. It's sort of like the body's way of text messaging from one area to another area. And so these are chemical signals, and like a text, they're extremely specific. So in other words, if I'm sending you a text, I'm only sending you and no one else. And so it's a series of glands, and so these glands are producing these hormones. And so I'm going to go top down, and this particular video is not going into the detail of what the hormones are that these glands are producing, but rather just the general function of hormones and how hormones are regulated and what's the story with them. But I want to introduce the whole system. And again, a system is a group of organs that are working together in a coordinated way. And so up in the brain, did you know your endocrine system was in the brain as well? So up in the brain, you have this little tiny gland right up here called the hypothalamus. Hypo meaning below the thalamus, which is right above it. Then you have this pineal gland, which is sitting right there, sort of in between both hemispheres of the brain. Then on this little tiny stalk right there is the pituitary gland. Very small, very powerful. It secretes so many hormones. It's right and quite impressive. Then here in our throat, right here along our vocal cord or larynx, we have a butterfly-shaped gland called the thyroid, which is really important. All of these are really important, so needless to say. And then posterior to the thyroid, in other words, on the backside, are parathyroid glands. There's 4 of them. And then right below that is the thymus, right there, this thymus gland right there, which is famous for helping to produce T cells, which are part of our immune system. And then the liver is capable of producing some hormones. We have adrenal glands, which are sitting on top of the kidneys. The kidney itself can produce hormones. One of them, I said I wasn't going to mention them, but I'm just frothing to do so. The kidney produces a really critical hormone called erythropoietin, or just EPO for short, which helps to regulate the amount of red blood cell production we have in our bones. It's rather important. And pancreas, very, very important endocrine organ. What's interesting about the pancreas, and I'll just mention this, is that it has a dual functionality. It can be an endocrine gland, which means that it's producing hormones for the blood, or it could be exocrine. Exo. So let me write that out, even though that's coming a little bit later. Exocrine as opposed to endocrine. Endo meaning into the blood, which is what we're studying now. Exocrine meaning to the outside, although it's not really secreting to the outside per se. What we mean by outside is anything other than the blood. So it's secreting through a pancreatic duct into the upper part of the small intestine, and it's secreting pancreatic juices for digestion. And then, you know, hormones are often associated with reproduction, although there's so many different functionalities of hormones. But the ovaries in females obviously produce hormones, and the counterpart in a male would be the testes. And there's 2 ovaries, 2 testes, and those are producing hormones as well. And then the placenta in a pregnant female is also a new emerging organ that secretes important hormones. And so let's jump into this brain here and this pineal gland. Again, this video is not for a discussion of particular hormones, although I'm tempted to do so on occasion. Like, for example, the pineal gland, the name itself means that it's sort of shaped like a little tiny pine cone, and it produces melatonin, if you've heard of that particular chemical before. Melatonin is very small. It's sort of a derivative of an amino acid. So it would be an example of a non-steroid hormone, and it helps regulate sleep-wake patterns in humans. In other animals, melatonin does some interesting things. It's also related to seasonal kinds of things, circadian rhythms to try to detect seasons. So animals know when to produce a coat or change coloration for seasons, for camouflage, for example. And it's interesting because as you get older, your melatonin levels go down, they decrease, and this melatonin is thought to be related to why teenagers find themselves needing to get a little bit more sleep, as it turns out. So a lot of study needs to be done on melatonin in particular. But I want to emphasize this region right in here. This gland called the hypothalamus is a really critical one because it produces hormones that regulate the pituitary gland. And so it's kind of a controlling kind of gland. And the pituitary gland is small. It's on this little stalk right here. And what's funny is, like, this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. But we don't use front and back. We use anatomical terms like anterior and posterior. So though I say it's funny, the pituitary gland is about the size of a pea, but it's subdivided into two lobes. There's this anterior lobe, and then there is a posterior lobe, and they do different things. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to create a video just on the pituitary gland because it's rather important. So in general, hormones are chemicals that are then secreted by the cells that are producing them, and they travel into the bloodstream. And so they're cruising in the plasma of the blood, along with all the other things in the blood, like, for example, your sugar and your calcium is in the blood, and like various immunoglobulins, for example, are in the plasma. So these hormones are cruising in the bloodstream, and they're looking to find the appropriate receptor. So they're like little keys cruising around, and I mentioned the analogy of texting. So they're cruising around and they're waiting to find the cell that they're specifically supposed to communicate with, because that's what these hormones are all about: communication. So what are they communicating? Well, they're going to communicate to the cell to either do something, get the cell to do something, like stimulate it to be a catalyst. Okay, start doing this, start dividing, start growing, start producing. Or they could be inhibitory, meaning like, hey, slow that down, or stop doing that. And so here's a cell, one cell, but it's really part of a gland. So I'll just do this. So here's an example of an endocrine gland, but one cell in particular works. It's secreting something, this blue little dot right there. And so that blue dot is a hormone. This hormone is then, of course, as we just said, traveling in the bloodstream. And so every cell is in contact with the bloodstream. It's this network. And so the blue is cruising along like this, but it doesn't interact with this cell because this cell doesn't have the appropriate receptor. So the receptor is obviously this is a cartoon, so it's exaggerated. It's not protruding that far away from the cell, but it's a membrane-bound protein. So it's embedded in the phospholipid bilayer. And what's interesting about that is that it's not acting per se as an ion channel. You might be familiar with those, but rather its structure, like a baseball glove, is specific for this particular enzyme. So this is a great example of hormone target receptor protein specificity. And so if this were to meet with the receptor protein, it'll cause the cell to do something. And so the cell will alter its metabolism, which is a series of chemical reactions that occur in the cell. So that's what's happening here. Now, this is in general. Some hormones, the truth is, some hormones can actually permeate the cell membrane, in other words, come in. Some hormones are restricted and cannot pass through the bilayer. So those of you who are impressive in your knowledge of biochemistry would probably predict those steroid hormones, which are lipid soluble, have an easier time permeating into the cell, and non-steroid hormones have to rely on binding to receptors and let secondary messages do their work, and I'll mention that a little bit later. But I mentioned how endocrine glands are secreted hormones into the blood, whereas exocrine is to the outside. So here's some examples of exocrine so you can contrast those. Exocrine glands would be the 3 salivary glands that we have, and those produce saliva. Via ducts, they enter into the oral cavity, so that's to the outside. So sweat glands to the outside, mammary glands to the outside, lacrimal glands, which are right above the eye, tears to the outside. So all of those are examples of exocrine glands. But we're talking about endocrine, and so endocrines are producing hormones into the bloodstream. And what they do is they affect metabolic reactions only in target cells. And an example of that would be to tell the cell to start to divide. And here are 2 cells that are dividing right here. And so their actions are precise and they only affect specific target cells. And so another characteristic of a hormone is that they're needed in just minute concentrations. You don't need a lot to overwhelm the target cell. Just telling the target cell what to do is enough. And so the concentrations of them in the blood are rather small. Here's an example of a steroid hormone called progesterone. You might have heard of it. It's a female hormone. And progesterone is a steroid because it's made up of these 4 carbon rings right here. It's a characteristic of a lipid. And it's also very nonpolar. In other words, it dissolves easily in lipids and not in water. What's interesting is that the ovary produces progesterone. And it travels in the blood, not very far, but its target is this big structure right here, which is a cut open uterus. Now the uterus is the female organ where an embryo and then a fetus develops into a baby. Sometimes it's simply referred to as the womb. And so the progesterone, promise not to go into all the details of the hormones, but here I am, sorry about that. Progesterone produced by the estrogen causes the inner lining to thicken, which provides nutrient for the growing embryo. This big, thick, muscular portion of the uterus is ultimately what's going to provide the muscle to contract and then push the baby out of the body via the birth canal. So pretty awesome. So when I was mentioning how some hormones can get into a cell easy and some not, this is what I was talking about. The steroid hormones, like for example progesterone or estrogen, can easily diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer. And when they come into the cell, they cruise through the cytoplasm. They can actually go through a nuclear pore and go into the nucleus. And there, they bind with a hormone receptors, like someone greeting them. And then that receptor hormone complex interacts with DNA. And so I won't go far into this, though I'm tempted to do so, is along DNA there's approximately 30 to 35,000 genes. And so what's interesting is you can get genes to start producing or stop producing, whether or not these proteins interact with them or not. So they affect transcription. Long story short is that if this hormone is interacting with the receptor complex, it might get this gene to be transcribed, which then produces messenger RNA, which then goes in the ribosome in the cytoplasm and produces a protein. And now, what's that protein going to do? This protein can be an enzyme, and it could affect metabolic pathways within the cytoplasm. So long story short is hormones can get cells to do things. They themselves don't participate, but it's the enzymes that they get going. And of course, the instructions to make the enzyme are on DNA. So it's kind of cool. So an example of a steroid that we often consume, perhaps we should be consuming less, is cholesterol. You might know it. It's found in butter, and it's also found in meat products, like muscle, for example. So cholesterol, when it comes in, if we have too much cholesterol, what's interesting about it is the liver can actually take cholesterol and rip off some of its functional groups and turn it into other hormones. And so the basic structure of a steroid is it's kind of fascinating. You can sort of, the body can use it and make more cortisol if it needs that, or more progesterone if it needs that. So it's kind of versatile. So these non-steroid hormones I mentioned before are important too, but what they do is they bind to receptor proteins in the cell membrane. Now I know this says cell wall, but in fact we don't have a cell wall, humans. It's a cell membrane. So what happens is this hormone will bind to a receptor, and what will happen is if something binds, some kind of ligand binds with a protein, it often changes the shape of the protein. And if the protein changes its shape, that will affect various other proteins in the cytoplasm. So in other words, here's an analogy, someone comes to your house and knocks on the door, and it causes everyone to go running around doing something. So the person never came in, but it's all these little secondary events. It's called signal transduction. So there's reception from the hormone, and then all these secondary messengers. I'll give you an example of this in a moment. And then ultimately, that causes some kind of response by the cell. Either it's going to divide, or it's going to grow, or it's going to do something. So these are the three steps, rather important, in what's simply called signal transduction, which is reception, signal transduction, and response. And so an example of a non-steroid hormone is insulin. It's a fairly short polypeptide. These are amino acids. There's two chains, an A chain, an alpha chain, and a beta chain, and they're held together by disulfide bridges, which are between the cysteine amino acids. So say a non-steroid hormone like insulin binds to a receptor. Okay, that's going to change the shape, and when that protein changes shape, so it's kind of like a little cascade here. Now we're going to talk about the secondary messengers. So this is the signal transduction. And so that shape change causes, don't be intimidated by the names. I mean, I don't know why you would be, but they're just, I find it fascinating. The more detailed a pathway is, I find that remarkable. You could look this up, or you could print it out, or you could somehow remember it and access it in the future. There's no need to memorize anything, but it's kind of cool. So the hormone comes, sort of knocks on the door, and then that protein changes shape, which then affects this G protein, which is associated with the receptor. That alters its shape, and then therefore activates adenylate cyclase. Now that the ACE implies that that's an enzyme, and so that activates that enzyme, which then, it's kind of cool, then converts ATP, adenosine triphosphate, to a compound similar called cyclic AMP. So it loses a couple phosphates. And cyclic AMP, or cyclic AMP, is capable, therefore, when it's in high concentration, of activating something called protein kinases. Now, kinases are, the name implies that there's movement there. And so what happens is these kinases, when they become activated, can then activate other substrates to become more active. And then ultimately, these things will either interact with genes or other enzymes, producing some sort of cellular response. And so I know that's kind of detailed. I apologize for that. One more time through that. So say that there's some kind of hormone and it's a growth hormone. Say it's a human growth hormone, and it binds to the outside. It's going to change the shape of the protein. It's not going to come in, but it's going to use all these secondary messengers. This is what's known as signal transduction, because you're transducting the message. And so this becomes active, and then this becomes active, and sometimes it involves sticking phosphates onto these proteins, which activates them. But ultimately, this is what the hormone is doing, getting the cell to do something. And so that could mean that this kinase then comes into the nucleus, which then activates by attaching its phosphate onto a transcription factor, which is then going to perhaps allow RNA polymerase to bind to the promoter of a particular gene and then transcribe that gene. Therefore, messenger RNA travels out of the nucleus onto a ribosome, which then produces a protein, and then the cell's doing something that it wasn't doing before. So, pretty awesome. So, in addition to hormones, we have these compounds called prostaglandins. And then the big difference between a prostaglandin and a hormone is that these things are kind of small as well. They're usually derivatives of fatty acids, if you're familiar with those compounds. So they're lipids. But the key is that I put in bold here that they're locally produced. So they're produced in the organ, and they affect either that particular organ or just the tissue surrounding it. And so some examples is that they can cause smooth muscles to relax or contract. They can cause a gland adjacent to it to start secreting a hormone. It can influence blood pressure or inflammation. I welcome you to sort of look up prostaglandins and look at all the different examples and functions. Pretty interesting. So in general, control of hormone secretions are very important. I want you to pay attention to these. So in other words, how does the body regulate its production? How does it produce hormones, and how does it stop producing hormones? And so one of the things is that their regulation is very precise. That's A. Number B is there's some control mechanisms that affect the regulation of the hormone, meaning that I mentioned this before earlier in the video, that the hypothalamus, which is in the brain, that plays a real important control because it produces inhibiting and releasing hormones which affect the pituitary gland. But the nervous system in general can influence hormones. Like, for example, if I'm in a car accident or something traumatic, or I see something, that might initiate the production of a hormone like epinephrine, for example. And so that could then affect my heart rate to increase and my breathing rate to increase. So the nervous system can influence the gland to produce the hormone. And then other glands respond directly to internal fluid composition, meaning that if blood sugar is low, then the pancreas is going to produce the hormone glucagon. If the blood sugar is high, then the pancreas is going to produce the hormone insulin to lower blood sugar. And so a lot of examples of this that we'll be looking at, like for example, calcium levels in the blood. These are regulated by hormones. But of course, the hormone production is in fact regulated by the composition of the chemical that it's influencing. And so another important way in which hormones are regulated are what's called negative feedback. And I think most of us are familiar with negative feedback, like for example, a thermostat in your house. If it's too cold in the house and your thermostat is set for a certain temperature, it'll initiate the heater to turn on. But then when it gets too hot, that initiates the heater to turn off. And then it was cold, it turns back on. And so it's regulated this way. So for example, in the body, if there's a gland, A, that is producing a product, B, when the product is in high concentration, that inhibits gland A from stimulating the production of B. And likewise, when B is in low concentration, that stimulates A to produce more B. And so it's really efficient. And so, like, well, how do we even know this? Well, we can measure the concentration of a hormone over time. And so if it's low, that gland starts making more of the hormone, and when there's a lot of it, it stops making it. And then when it's low, it starts making it. And when it's high, it stops making it. And so overall, if you took the average of this, you would see that it's fairly constant. And so the hormones are regulated rather precisely. And so this is what I wanted to say about introduction to the endocrine system. It's a tremendously interesting and very important system, and I hope you have an opportunity to watch the following videos on the various glands of the endocrine system. And I hope you learned a lot about the intro to the endocrine system. Thanks for watching.